What sets policy analysts apart is their ability to confront trade-offs and allow people who are in the public realm and different stakeholders to understand the trade-offs between policies. Even the best policies have weaknesses and have costs for certain groups. By the end of this class, you will understand how to confront trade-offs in the way that you think about the trade-offs that each policy brings forth to us. And we will do this through a graph. We will do that, use the analysis that we did in the previous lecture and begin to apply it. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit more about confronting trade-offs. In my experience, confronting trade-offs brings me to three key questions. What do we value? In other words, what do I value? What is practical, and how does this affect the most vulnerable? I'm going to talk a little bit more about these before we go on to the process of looking at the trade-offs. When I think about value, I think about financial value, I think about moral value, I think about the consequences, the historical analysis of the context within which I am writing policy. I think about equity and about how this policy is either diminishing equity, reinforcing power, or fighting power, or dismantling certain power structures. In doing so, I'm also thinking continuously about what is practical. What can we actually do? What can this policy actually achieve? And finally, how does this affect the most vulnerable? That's been a critical question that's allowed me to think more deeper about the policy trade-offs that I'm confronted with. To help us think a little bit more about this, I've taken our graph, our table that we created here, and here's the one graph, but I've copied and pasted that and given us a sense of what this looks like visually for us. We have our policies at the top. Policy 1 is blue, policy 2 is red, and policy 3 is green. We have the totals on the right-hand side. Now these can already help you see visually the impact of our policies, and this will help you shape your recommendations. But confronting trade-offs is not about looking at the highest number, but really understanding the nuances about what you value and how this is going to affect the most vulnerable and what is most practical. So what we've got to do is look at each of these policies and think about them more deeply, looking at what we value the most. So we can immediately see that policy 2 is the most enforceable policy, and it's also appealing to the bureaucracy, which might be something we need to consider if bureaucratic flexibility is something we need to get this policy through. We also need to think about equity. How does this distribute resources? And we've seen already that policy 3 does the best and policy 1 does the worst. Policy 2 seems to be in the middle. That's something we may consider, considering it did well in the flexibility piece, the economic efficiency piece. And then we need to ask ourselves about political feasibility. We need to ask ourselves as a policy analyst, realistically, what does my political environment look like? And how will this policy operate in that environment? And we've already made note that policy 1 and policy 2 would operate best and policy 3 would operate the worst in this case. Cost is often the most important thing to consider, and we can immediately see that policy 3 is the most expensive, and I would say policy 2 may be a little bit more expensive, but we opted to say that it would be more or less the same as the existing budget. And finally, when we look at social costs, we say that policy 1 actually has the highest social cost. Remember, 5 is the worst thing to have in this case, and 1 being the best to have. Now, this is where we think about what we value. Given the context of this group of students who are most affected, the lowest income students, the marginalized, historically marginalized students, we would have to say that policy 1 and 2, if we value social costs, policy 2 and 3 are the most desirable costs, and we're willing to spend more money, and we're willing to go to a stronger political battle for those. not only in the political world, but in the bureaucratic world. As we will see here, it's the least effective. So what we've got to try and decide here is what we're willing to give up. Are we willing to take on the political fight? In other words, policy 2 is great on the political front. It's also great on the administrative front. It's not so bad on the fairness front. It's not terrible on the financial front, and it's not terrible on the social front, which is probably what makes this policy not only the highest number, but also the most desirable policy, because it sort of takes the middle ground between these two policies, 1 and 3. And so this is an idea of the type of conversations that this kind of table gives you to think about these individually and think about them in a nuanced way. Think about your ability to expend political capital, to expend financial capital. And if you are in a tight environment where you have limited political capital and financial capital, then you need to look at these and ask yourself fundamental questions about resources, not only political resources, but financial resources as well. So this is an example of confronting trade-offs. I'm going to take policy 2 as the adopted policy that I'm going to recommend to my boss, and we will be talking a little bit about that in the next lecture.